This video will look at politics in the American West. We want to understand the process of state creation, examine currents in Western political thought, and identify major developments in Western politics. To begin with, we need to understand that there is a long history of government in the American West that actually extends before the United States of America arrived there. So if we take a look, for example, at Native Americans, Americans, when they first arrived on the scene, they thought that Native Americans were, practiced basically a system of anarchy. There was no leadership, no person in power. Usually they just believed that there was one guy named a chief that controlled things, and, they basically were in a state of either war or peace, and that was it with people surrounding them. Today, we understand, though, that Native Americans, their cultures, their politics were very diverse, and they could be very complex. You had some Native American tribes that had hierarchical systems, so if you take a look at the Mississippian cultures and those groups that descended from them, they had highly organized societies, highly organized communities with very clear leadership, very clear processes of deciding what we would call laws, basically deciding on what a community would do, what it would accept, what it would not accept. You had some Native communities that could be highly democratic, to the point of, almost being more confederacies than they were, organized, stratified societies, even down to the clan level, even down to the individual level. So if you take a look at the Comanche, for example, the Comanche were a definitive people. They had a definitive language, definitive material and non-material culture. But when it came down to it, did they recognize that they had a territory that was Comanche land? Absolutely. Did they recognize that they had common enemies? Definitely. Allies, of course. But each band could basically determine its own course, whether to go to war or not to go to war. Whether they wanted to link up with other bands or not, those decisions were left to that band. And then even to individuals within the band, they could decide whether or not they wanted to stay with that group or if they wanted to move to another group. So there was a lot of fluidity in it. So there were a lot of customs, a lot of traditions. These rooted people into a network, into a way of engaging with others in these social settings. In terms of external native or external tribal affairs, there were definitely customs that revolved around this as well. There was a way to determine whether or not you were going to go to war with somebody. It was usually an internal process. There was recognized territoriality between the different tribes. Different groups understood, this is my territory, that is your territory. And they would fight over it. They would form alliances, alliances that were no less formal than anything that was being created in Eurasia or Africa or other parts of the world. So a good example, again, if we go back to the Comanche, is, their relationship with the Kiowa. They were two distinctive cultures that came together, recognizing that they had mutual interests and that they could get along, and they created an alliance that basically dominated the Southern Plains for almost 200 years. And it wasn't just simply Native Americans. There were other people in this part of the world that preceded the United States of America. So you had the Spaniards, for example, with their distinctive system, where you had governors that were appointed with extensive powers. Their power, of course, they weren't there to micromanage. So towns had their own ayuntamientos, led by alcaldes, and they determined their own affairs, their own laws. They regulated the lives of their own citizens. And then, once Mexico declared independence and gained its independence from Spain, They established a new system of government that was one based on a federal model in which you had state governments, each with their own respective territories. But even if you go beyond the formal kind of institutionalized types of governments, there were other forms of government and politics and law in this part of the world that, again, preceded the United States. So British fur traders were very active in this part of the world. In these companies, they had a vested interest in maintaining order within their own communities. They had a vested interest in reserving the right to negotiate with Native Americans so as to facilitate trade. So one of the best examples of this, which was the Hudson's Bay Company and John McLaughlin, who was dispatched to Oregon country, and there he basically governed, with a very strong hand, and created a very valuable trade network for the British Crown that relied on a system of organized posts and fur trader communities and networks that governed this part of the country or the part of the world until the Americans began to overwhelm the HBC agents in terms of population. And then it switched to American. Mining camps, if you go and you watch a lot of these 1940s and 50s and 60s spaghetti Western movies, what usually do you see in the mining camps with guys like, John Wayne and Clint Eastwood? Well, it seems like almost, an example of lawlessness. Every individual carries a gun. Every individual settles his own scores, and it's all to the tough individualist, male figure, that's carving his own way in the region. And we know today that this isn't true. Mining camps were highly organized. Miners would come together. They would band together. They would establish committees and basically courts to protect their property, their lives, and most importantly, their claims. Individuals that were seen as infringing on these property rights were swiftly dealt with, sometimes in the form of hanging. But it doesn't mean that procedural justice was absent. There was procedure, usually preceding, a hanging, if you will. So mining camps, no, very legalistic. They brought the legal culture from the east to the west with them. Wagon trains, again, organized. They had hierarchy, usually a captain. He had subordinates that helped him. And people came together with recognized laws, and there was an understanding that there were consequences if you breached those laws. If you, for example, stole another person's property or attacked another person's person. And then even with cattle ranchers, cattle ranchers commonly would form together in associations to protect their herds and run down thieves that threaten their property. So before the American government came along, there was government in this part of the world, and it took many different forms. Now, the American government that becomes Western government starts with the territorial process. And it actually began with the territorial process east of the Mississippi River. So the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is what established the process by which new governments were formed. It started with Congress appointing a governor, a secretary, and 3 judges to the territory. These individuals were, for all practical purposes, the law. However, they had to recognize and protect certain basic rights. The First, the Second, the Fourth, the Fifth Amendments, all these things were in effect in the territories. So just because you were an appointed governor didn't make you dictator of Ohio territory. So this is the type of government that they had through the district phase. And then once there were 5,000 people, 5,000 settlers, then they were able to form a territorial government. And the territorial government was formed by the appointed governor, and a popularly elected territorial legislature, which then helped to appoint a legislative council. And it was the governor, the legislature, and the legislative council that together formed laws that then governed the territory. And again, these laws had to adhere to the basic rights contained in the Bill of Rights. In addition to that, there was a non-voting delegates that was sent to Congress to be their voice in the formal American government. And so the Northwest Ordinance provides basically the process. This is the step 1, step 2, step 3 process involved in creating a new government. Behind that, in 1836, came the pattern, if you will, or the model. And this was the Wisconsin Organic Act of 1836. And so with the Wisconsin Organic Act of 1836, this becomes the legislative template that Congress then used from 1836 all the way up through, and in fact, arguably even today, for the government of territories. So it doesn't matter if it was Utah Territory, Idaho Territory, or Hawaii Territory, or even the modern territory of Guam. If you take that Wisconsin Organic Act and compare it to these territorial acts, they're basically one and the same. The only exception is Alaska. And Alaska was effectively treated as an extension of Oregon and later Washington, up until it was formally organized into a state. So usually its courts of law fell under West Coast courts of law. Now, the statehood process and the territorial process were governed by a number of different factors. First off, when you're going through territorial governments, you got to understand that territorial governments were appointed by Congress. Usually whoever controlled Congress was going to control that territorial government. So it would reflect the political realities of Washington, D.C. In addition to that, usually your large economic interests in the area, they tended to have a lot of pull in territorial governments. So a good example is Nebraska Territory, which, even after its territorial phase, it entered into statehood. It was the railroad interests with all of their land, their control over the rail network, that largely dictated what the territorial legislature and then later the state legislature did. So if you go into other parts of the country, you would find not only railroads that largely controlled legislatures, you find mining companies like Montana and the Anaconda Copper Mining Company, for example. If you went into large areas with large ranching populations, like Wyoming or Montana, of course, cattlemen's associations had a large pull there as well. Now, the one thing that really dictated actually gaining statehood and therefore an equal footing with the other states depended on the time and the circumstances of the territory. So prior to the Civil War, it was always slavery. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 basically set the pattern. If you had a territory that was a slave territory with enough people ready to enter the Union, you had to go find yourself a free territory to balance it. Now, once slavery went away, though, then there were other issues that came into play. So for most Western governments, Western territories, it was really just a question of population and self-government. Whether it was Nebraska, the Dakotas, Colorado, Idaho, usually the question is, did they reach the 60,000 person population? That was phase 3 of the Northwest Ordinance. So phase 1, remember, that's Congress appointing everything. Phase 2, once you hit 5,000 people, you elect your own territorial government. Once you hit 60,000 people, then you got admitted as a state. But it didn't mean that you had to be admitted immediately. Congress did not have to act within a certain time frame. So those countries where it was just an issue of population and self-government, well, it was pretty easy decision to make. There were other territories, though, that had more complex issues surrounding statehood. So number of territories like New Mexico and Arizona and Hawaii, it was a large issue of demographic issues. So Arizona and New Mexico, there were significant populations of Latin Americans, which many congressmen, keep in mind, early 1900s, still a lot of nativism. You have the revival of the Ku Klux Klan, and there was, a lot of racism. So they didn't want large Latin American populations coming into the Union as citizens. And then later on with Hawaii, Hawaiians were always interested in gaining statehood, especially the descendants of missionaries and the plantation owners. But over 1/3 of the population consisted of Japanese Americans alone. They were and still are the largest demographic sector of the population there. So, if you actually looked at the Euro-American population in Hawaii in the early 1900s, they were maybe 1/3 of the entire population. This time you still had a large but still shrinking native Hawaiian population. And again, the vast majority of the other people living there were Asian. For Utah, the big question was polygamy. Up until 1890, polygamy was embraced by the Mormon Church. But once the Edmunds Act was passed, once their leadership was basically hunted down by the federal government and imprisoned, property threatened, the Mormon Church came together and they issued their famous mandate in 1890 that basically said, okay, we're not condoning polygamy anymore. And then what happened? 6 years later, statehood. And this wasn't the first time that the territory of Utah attempted statehood. They did it early in the 1850s. They presented Congress right off the bat with what they believed was a model state constitution that Congress would not be able to turn down. But what did Congress say? Well, they said absolutely not. Why? Well, first, they're Mormons. Second of all, they're polygamists. And it was like a 40-some-odd-year struggle for Mormons to get that congressional approval. And then finally, when it comes to Alaska and Hawaii, there was the big issue of just simple contiguity. Most Americans couldn't wrap their heads around admitting states into the Union that were not physically connected to the lower 48 states. And so what happened there is you had a combination of growing populations in the islands and Cold War, military realities that basically forced Americans to move on the issue. So first off, you had large populations that were in the islands and were in Alaska at that point. But probably more important to the Americans was the role that the Alaska and Hawaii played in American defenses. Alaska, even today, is a major location for American air bases. So when it comes to American air defense, and when it came to SAC, Strategic Air Command, they needed to hold on to this territory. When it came to Hawaii, Hawaii is and was the linchpin, if you will, for American naval defenses and projection of power in the Pacific Ocean. So here you have Russia that's basically saying, America's still a colonial power because it has territories like Alaska and Hawaii. America, on the other hand, saying, no, we're not. We are about freedom and liberty and anti-imperialism. And so with all these pressures surrounding them, they finally relented to statehood. And the thing that was really kind of the clincher, if you will, for its statehood was the fact that Alaskans at the time tended to sway more Democratic in their voting, Hawaiians more Republican, again, because of plantation control. And so, both of the two major parties in Congress that believed that they would be able to maintain, their status quo. Now, in terms of government in the West, the West has been a place of, what you could call, a little bit more radical than the rest of the country. I mean, they tend to follow many of the same major trends, but at the same time, they were traditionally places where, radicalism was alive and well. Some examples of this, in the Great Plains were the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry. This movement that started in the 1860s that was all about, educating farmers on good planting strategies and providing community, which then morphed into the Farmers Alliance, which carried on, a lot of the same goals of the Grange, but it was the Farmers Alliance that gave birth to the Populist Party in 1891. The Populist Party, which in the Omaha platform called for, the backing of the U.S. currency by silver and gold, that called for changes in referendum initiative, in recall, that called for an 8-hour workday trying to fuse together with labor. So one thing that's always really kind of been found throughout many Western states then and today is definitely this greater degree of what we could call democratic tendencies. So the recall, let's see if I can write here. I'm just not even going to attempt it at this point. I don't have my mouse with me. So the recall referendum initiative, really popular in Western states. The recall is basic idea here is, if a politician's acting the way the voters don't like, you can, vote to keep them or toss them. Referendum, if there's a law that voters don't agree with, they can demand that the legislature put it up for referendum vote. They can vote it up or down. And then the initiative, actual people, initiating the legislative process. This was found in a number of Western states. Western states were also the very first to empower and enfranchise women. So before women got the franchise with the 19th Amendment, they had already been enfranchised in Western states. In addition to that, you found a number of communist and socialist communities in the American West in the late 1800s, early 1900s. 1915, a movement began that was formed by Arthur Townley, William Lemke, and Lynn Fraser, the Nonpartisan League, that was openly socialist and called for state-owned banks, state-owned grain elevators, and state-backed farm insurance. World War I, same time nonpartisan leagues forming. You had the Grain Corn Rebellion along the southern branch of the Canadian River in Oklahoma, which was an armed uprising against not only World War I, but against what they viewed were these wealthy landowners and these wealthy interests that kept small farmers from achieving the American dream. And this doesn't include the labor unions. You had labor unions in Kansas City. You had labor unions like the International or Industrial Workers of the World, found throughout the American West. The United Mine Workers was alive and active. They were the main organization fighting for better pay, for example, at the Ludlow Massacre. So there is this branch of radicalism. But then what happens? Well, first off, after World War I, with the Red Scare and the rise of communist Russia, there was a conservative pushback in many Western states against this radicalism. So this is kind of like this resurgence against it, this kind of balance, if you will, against this radicalism. So don't assume that all Westerners were radical. Another thing that changes, towards after World War I is the relationship of the West with the federal government. So there was always federal support of Western communities, always. Western communities depended on railroads, which depended on federal land grants. Western communities needed security, and they usually turned to the U.S. Army. So the federal government was always there. The New Deal brought the federal government face to face with individual Westerners. So some of their legislation, like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, this sought to help save farmers, especially in the Great Plains that were suffering from the Dust Bowl, by basically paying them not to plant. So since there was a glut of agricultural produce and since they needed to raise agricultural prices, the idea was, hey, I'm going to pay you money basically not to work. Let your land lay fallow. And this fed into another program they had, which was the Soil Conservation Service, that went out to work with farmers to conserve the most precious resource farmers had on their land, which was the soil itself. They had a number of reclamation projects, the Grand Coulee Dam, the Hoover Dam. You had the Civilian Conservation Corps out there. You had the Resettlement Administration, which was active trying to settle farmers on lands that were marginally productive to places that weren't very well populated. So the New Deal really kind of changed this. And that's not to forget also the preservationist and conservationist movements of the Progressive Era, which began the process of reserving lands as national monuments, national parks, and national timberlands. Now, after World War II, though, this began to change. Why did it change? Well, first off, instead of changing demographics, demographics began to change. Excuse me. You had, first off, a lot of military bases established in the West. This tended to bring in a more conservative base into parts of the country, this part of the country. During World War II, you had another major migration of African Americans out of the South to not only cities in the North, but also to cities in the West. So, for example, Los Angeles. As African American families are moving to Western communities, we started to see an uptick in Latin American migration following World War II. And then, of course, with the Korean War, followed by, or really it starts with the Chinese Revolution, the communist victory, followed by the Korean War, the Vietnam War, bombings, or the American extension of Vietnam into Cambodia. You had increased migration, especially of Asian refugees, to Western communities. So you have all these changing demographics here. And at the same time that these demographics are changing, you're having a change in politics at the national level. So it's at this time period that we see kind of a flipping of the Republican and the Democratic parties. So it used to be the Democratic Party had its stronghold in the southern states as well as in many western states. They tended with the Democrats to usually be a little bit more pro-immigration, especially in the northern states. They usually were the ones to embrace populism, especially agrarian populism. But at the same time, the Democratic Party, followed in that same vein of limited government, being very limited government. In terms of ideology. The Republican Party, on the other hand, it started in 1854, as anti-slavery and as, pro federal involvement in the economy through internal improvements. So what happened? Well, with the Great Depression, with the New Deal, you had FDR who came into power, and he switches democratic ideology to say, no, we're going to use the federal government to help people economically. And so it's under him that you have the Democratic Party that starts to embrace workers' rights, union rights. You had Eleanor Roosevelt that was constantly pushing FDR to support, even ethnic minorities. although FDR, tended to be very, resistant to it because he wanted to maintain that Southern base. Eleanor Roosevelt was always, trying to push FDR to support anti-lynching law, during the famous St. Louis incident where a passenger ship with Jewish refugees fleeing Europe arrived off the eastern coast. Eleanor Roosevelt was, begging FDR to give them asylum, but FDR said no. I gotta stick to the 1924 Johnson Reed immigration policy of keeping Jewish migrations really low. So he resisted this. But what happens after World War II? Well, the Democratic Party began to make compromise on some of its New Deal positions. So it began to compromise, for example, with Republicans on labor union rights and on the Full Employment Act of 1946, that meant to basically guarantee every American a job with a livable wage. So they're compromising on this stuff. And after World War II, they began to embrace instead civil rights movements and women's rights movements. And so it's what Alan Brinkley calls a race-based liberalism that they become associated with. So promoting racial equality, as well as using the federal government to create programs to help people economically. Republicans, on the other hand, what happens here? Well, they remained pro-business in the sense of passing business-friendly legislation. But many of their members were opposed to a lot of what's happening in the civil rights movement. They lost their base with the New Deal. In fact, the Democrats basically controlled Congress from the 1940s all the way to the 1990s. So the Republicans were looking around saying, okay, where can we find new support? Well, they found it in what were known as the Dixiecrats. These were Democrats from the South that were dissatisfied with Democratic support of civil rights. And they found the Republican Party, they found a hero in Barry Goldwater in the election in 1964, a guy that comes into power basically saying no to the New Deal, no to high taxes, wasn't a big fan of the civil rights movement at all. And so there's this, almost 9-year period, 4-year period, where the Republicans are, kind of moving in this direction of identifying with the South, but it's really under Nixon that they fully embrace what's called the Southern Strategy. So embracing small government, limited government, embracing low taxes, embracing pro-business legislation, but then also embracing the anti-civil rights position of Southerners. Only they didn't really come out and say we're blatantly against civil rights. Usually what they would do is, in the words of Lee Atwater, a principal strategist for the Republican Party under Nixon and throughout the 70s, they used code language, code words. So welfare, for example. When they attacked welfare, they were usually attacking, policies that were identified with them, that they identified with many Americans with civil rights. So you have this new Republican Party in the country, and it finds followers in the American West who like this idea of limited small government. So during the New Deal, all of these federal programs were great, to Westerners. Following the New Deal, it became burdensome to many of them. So the Sagebrush Rebellion, which began in the 1970s and continued into the 80s, was basically Westerners demanding that Congress release some of these federally held lands, especially under the Bureau of Land Management, lands that were earmarked as national parks, national monuments, national timberlands, national grasslands, and open them up to grazing, opened them up to mining, opened them up um, to timber extraction. And this became a really big push in many of the Western states. So for many Westerners, it was this, small government, getting rid of the federal presence on many of these reserved lands, in addition to the fact that many of them were socially conservative. And so all of these aspects of republicanism appealed to them. And so for many Western states, Ronald Reagan, when he came to power in the 1980s, here was a guy that was actually born in the Midwest and whose father, actually had a job to save the family house during the New Deal by one of FDR's New Deal programs. But Reagan himself, especially in the 50s, during the years of the HUAC, when he was the head of the Screen Actors Guild, which for all practical purposes is an actors union, he greatly supported the HUAC in their search for not only communists, but also the outing of LGBTQ members and other perceived radicals. He was a definite ardent supporter of low taxes and getting rid of a lot of the social programs and safety nets that were created by the New Deal. Again, the New Deal that his family benefited from when he was a kid. And he was also, even though he's a Midwesterner, he projected himself as a Westerner. So Westerns were really big during this time period, and he starred in some of them. So it wasn't unlike him to go out and ride around on his horse and take his political visitors out for these horse rides. But they found their hero in him. They found their hero in this figure, and so this is the period where the West really becomes linked to the Republican Party, with the exception, really, of California, Washington, Oregon, which remain really the only bastions of the Democratic Party left in the West. Although, again, we are going through changing demographics today. So some states which used to be a little bit more harder in the Republican category, like Colorado and New Mexico, are oftentimes viewed as swing states. In the 2016 election, the 2020 election, Arizona, which is a little bit surprising, Arizona definitely started coming into play for Democrats. And then increasingly, many political scientists are keeping their eyes open on Texas. Because of the changing demographics there, Latin American communities are increasing in number, and they tend to vote more Democratic. However, there have been some shifts within Latino voting lately, where they're actually supporting, in not great numbers, but in increasing numbers, Republican politics. So, who knows what the future holds for us in terms of political trends. So it's really, when we look at the West, where are we today? Well, post World War II, where the Western states tend to be much more conservative. They can still be a little radical. You do have the Western states do have their fair share of militias, and we've seen skinheads and neo-Nazis and eco-terrorists. Charlie Manson found his home out here in the American West. So there's no shortage of kind of radicals in this time period. That's a little bit different from what we saw during the New Deal, this time of Western states working with the federal government in these big projects. And that in and of itself was even different from earlier days with Western radicalism and the humble origins and the territorial governments in a world away from the forms of governments that preceded us.